Rabbi Myers.
Present.
How are you, Rabbi Myers?
Baruch Hashem, very good, thank you. Very good. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Congregation KINS's Wednesday night shir. Our parsha for this week in 5783, 2023. We will be discussing in this parsha an aspect of Parshat Shemot. This evening, we're going to talk about, as the main theme, identity. Identity is a very powerful, important term. And in Hebrew, it really has to do with being. And, in modern Hebrew, we call identity zehut, right? Zehu, or zehut, meaning that this is what we're looking at. But in the Torah, zeh certainly can be a pronoun which indicates a certain identity. But the Torah also uses perhaps a much broader term, and that is the shoresh hayo. The shoresh hayo, hey yud hey, means quite simply to be, to exist. And we're going to take a look now in Perek Gimel of Sefer Shemot, which is, and of course, in Parshat Shemot. We're going to take a look at the very first pasuk, and it's going to give us an idea of what the theme of Perek Gimel is. Umoshe haya ro'eh et son yitro chotno, kohen midyan. It says, and Moshe was a shepherd. Now, the Torah could have used the term vayireh with an ayin, not vayireh means like vayaras he saw. And here, that exists as the term haya, rather than using it in its normal sense, where the noun, the verb precedes the noun. The verb precedes the noun here. Moshe haya, he was a shepherd, shepherding the flock. And here, of course, we make an important distinction between what we do and what we are. What we do, like Vayomer, is an action. So Vayomer Hashem, Vayomer Moshe. So the verb precedes the noun, and it tells us what the person does. But here, when we use the verb hayo, and in this pasuk it says, Moshe haya ro'eh, he was a shepherd, it tells us about his essence, what he was, not just what he did. And the Torah tells us then, as we continue in the pasuk, Vayinhag et son et hatson achar midbar, and he, in his capacity of shepherd, led the sheep past, beyond. Achar midbar means beyond the deserts. We'll see what that means in just a moment. Vayavo el arho elokim choreva. He came to the mountain called, at that time, Rashi says it wasn't called Har Elokim at that time, but the Torah identifies it as Har HaElokim, the mountain upon which the Torah was given, and therefore it became associated eventually, 40 years later, as the mountain of God, because there HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the Torah to Am Yisrael through Moshe Rabbeinu. But of course, there's speculation. The Medrash tells us that in fact he was chasing a sheep, right? Or here the pasuk says specifically he was beyond the desert. So what in fact does it mean when we say that it was beyond the desert, or what was he doing there? And the Medrash says he was chasing a sheep, right? A sheep, an errant sheep that went off. And instead of just saying, okay, instead of 1,000 sheep or 500 sheep, so there'll be 499. But out of compassion, he chased the sheep. There, of course, he encounters the sneh, the bush. So in pursuit of a sheep, he found two things. First, he found God. And secondly, he found himself. To understand that statement, we have to just back up a little bit to the first, to Perek Bet, where we know that Moshe Rabbeinu, by chapter 2 in Sefer Shemot, already had found himself firmly a part of Paro's house. He may have known his parents intellectually, may have known the Jewish people intellectually, but he certainly did not have any meaningful interaction with them. He, after all, was separated in the palace. And I've mentioned earlier, not this year, but I've mentioned it in the past, that we have a very interesting pasuk that it says, "Vayigdal Moshe, Moshe Rabbeinu grew up, Vayetzei el Achav," and after growing up, he decided one day to go and to go see his brothers. Now, normally, I think we normally assume that his brothers are the Jews, okay, and because his mother may well have aroused within him curiosity about a people with whom he was, quote, identified, but with whom he could not identify. So he was, in the end, in the palace, and all the people that he knew were Egyptians. And it could very well be that he went out to see how the Egyptians were doing. After all, remember that the palace, if anybody's seen any of the major palaces that we have in the world, even today, there's Buckingham Palace, which is a huge fortress. People could get lost there. They could, no doubt they could go, if they wanted to, they could go years without seeing other people or interacting with other people. And I think probably that was the case with Moshe Rabbeinu, that he interacted with only with Egyptians. So, and he was, of course, and Rashi tells us that Paro was so pleased with Moshe Rabbeinu that he actually appointed him over the all palatial affair. Whatever had to do in the palace, that's what Moshe Rabbeinu was in charge of. So Rashi mentions that specifically. So he goes out, he decides to see what's going on. And Vayar Ish Mitzri, he saw an Egyptian man, Makeh Ish Ivri Me Echav. Now, in the same pasuk, the word Echav is used twice. Vayetzei el Echav, he went out to his brothers, and then he saw an Egyptian man killing or beating a Jewish man on the verge of death. There the Torah says me'achav. So there's no doubt that obviously the second me'achav is referring to the Jews. But what about the first one? Is the first one referring to when we see brothers? Does that mean that that he went out to his brothers, the Jews? Could be. Intellectually, he knows that his mother educated him. He knew, but his knowledge is only intellectual and only, shall we say, familial, because that was his family. So, okay, good, that's his mother, but he doesn't necessarily identify with all Jews everywhere. So it's interesting that Rabbeinu Ibn Ezra mentions on this pasuk, in pasuk Bet, in Perek Bet, when Moshe Rabbeinu went out to his brothers, he says the first time it said he went out to his brothers, the Egyptians, he saw them as his brothers. But then when he saw the cruelty, when he saw the cruelty and the evil which the Egyptians were inflicting upon the Jews, then it says Vayar Ish Mitzri Makeh, hitting, which really means killing, Ish Ivri Me'echav. Now Moshe Rabbeinu comes to the first turning point of his life. That is, what is his identity? When he left the palace that day, he saw himself pretty much as an Egyptian with Jewish heritage. Now, when he sees the cruelty inflicted upon this people, he now realizes he cannot identify as an Egyptian anymore, because we can use the term that's very often used in America now. He saw the systemic cruelty. It wasn't just one Egyptian man who was beating a Jewish man. It was a part of the entire complex of the Egyptian society that brought about this cruelty. And this man was only one of many, many people who treated the Jews as inferior beings. And now Moshe Rabbeinu has to make a decision. What is he? What shall he be? The next pasuk gives us an idea of that. And it says, Vayifen kol v'chol. He looked this way and that. Vayar ki ein ish, and he saw that there was no man there. Vayach et hamitzri. And he killed the Egyptian. Vayitmaneu b'chol. Now the question is, I'd like to give a little bit of a, shall we say, metaphorical interpretation of this. Given the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu's whole concept of his identity is now shaken. He completely saw himself as an Egyptian until he encountered, maybe for the first time, he was about 20 years old, a young man, because he had to be old enough to be placed in a position of authority and power in the palace, but he couldn't be that young that he doesn't know, what's going on. And now he see Vayifen kol v'chol here means metaphorically, perhaps midrashically, if you will. He looked at his Egyptian side, Vayifen kol v'chol, and he looked at his Jewish side, Vayar ki ein ish. And he saw he had no identity. The people with whom he identified until now were no longer people with whom he could identify. And then Rashi mentions to us that he couldn't actually identify with Jews either, because the next day when he went out, he sees two Jews fighting, and he says to one of them, Vayomer al Rasha, and he said to the one who was probably the more aggressive of the two, Lama take reyecha, why would you even raise a hand to hit your friend or your neighbor, right? And of course, that person identified by Chazal as either Datan or Aviram. It doesn't say so in the Torah, but there's nothing, certainly nothing that would deny that. He said to him, who made you a prince over us? Mi samcha ish sar aleinu, shofet aleinu. Who made you an authority over us to tell us and to give us criticism? And then he said, are you going to hit me? Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian yesterday? Now, then the Torah tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu, in his mind, uttered the words, Achen nodah hadavar. Now, the simplest interpretation of that is, Achen nodah hadavar, is that the matter of my killing the Egyptian is known throughout, because these two simple Jews knew about it. I thought there was no one there. But then Rashi once again tells us, he cites the Medrash, which says, Nodah davar, the matter is now known. What matter? Says Rashi that Moshe Rabbeinu said, now I know. I have an answer to a question that I had. How could it be? What has this people done to anybody that would merit such cruel treatment of them, enslaving them, beating them, killing their children? What could they possibly have done? And then Rashi cites the Medrash, which says, I know, now I know. Achen nodah hadavar. There was no concern one for the other. You recall last week we talked about the idea of the brotherhood of the Jewish people, and we learned that Yehuda actually carved out this concept of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh, that we have so firmly committed to us, that all Jews are responsible. Every Jew is responsible. He's an orev. Literally, our fate is intertwined. That's what an orev is. Orev is a combination of two separate things into one, making them both into one. That's what an eruv is. It takes two different homes or two different environments, and by use of the eruv, so they now become one. And so all Jews are intertwined. We share a common faith. But Moshe Rabbeinu did not see them, at least according to this Rashi. And therefore he said, now I know why they're suffering. They don't care about each other at all. They couldn't have seen that I was trying to help. So now he runs away. We don't know how long he ran away from Egypt. He ran away, but we do know this. We know that he had to be probably at least 20 when this happened. We know that and he went back to Mitzrayim to take the Jews out when he was 80. That's when he spoke to Paro. So decades passed. We don't have any definitive, at least in terms of the Torah, if any definitive knowledge of where he was. The Midrashim speculate. That's beyond the scope of our discussion. So decades later, 5 decades, 6 decades later, we pick the story up and we see that Moshe Rabbeinu chases this sheep, at least according to the Medrash, and he's on Har HaElokim, finds himself on the mountain, the very mountain where years later he will take the Jewish people to receive the Torah. And there he encounters, chasing the sheep, trying to find the sheep. As I said before, he finds Hashem. We're going to see he finds himself. Now, the Torah tells us that a malach came to him, that Moshe saw the malach, and the malach saw Moshe. And it's interesting that some midrashim say actually that there were other people there, but great people see things that other people don't. Moshe Rabbeinu saw the burning bush; the others did not. It was his vision, and then Hashem appears to Moshe Rabbeinu mitoch hasaneh. I find very often, this is my own personal thought, and as it's very likely that it's wrong, but I still believe that this is so. When it says that Hashem spoke to Moshe mitoch hasneh, doesn't mean that Hashem had compacted himself into the sneh. Could be, absolutely could be. God can do anything. That's what some people, many people call tzimtzum, God's capacity to contract his being into that. But I don't think that we are compelled to say that. If I have I thought about this when one of my grandchildren was looking at a video of his parents' wedding. He was maybe 3 years old or so, and he said, "But how did they get inside? How did they get inside the computer? Couldn't see that, didn't understand it." So, if it's the same thing as the bush, God doesn't have to be in a bush. God used the bush, the sneh, as a medium by which he communicated to Moshe Rabbeinu. Just as a radio is the means to communicate, or the medium to communicate to people, whether it's that or it's television, whatever it may be. So too, that God used the bush as the means or the medium to communicate to Moshe Rabbeinu, but we're not compelled to say that he was, so to speak, in the bush. Now, HaKadosh Baruch Hu calls him through the malach, and now through a dialogue that goes on, which we won't go into now, Moshe Rabbeinu says, "All right," and of course he's trying to avoid the mission. Moshe Rabbeinu tries his best to avoid the mission, and he says, "But if I go to Mitzrayim, I go to Egypt, as you want me to do, God, then who shall I tell him sent me? I need a password of some sort." So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to him, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. There's that verb again. Being, existence, u'Moshe haya ro'etz. And here HaKadosh Baruch Hu also is described as of haya, ehyeh asher ehyeh. Now, it's often translated as I will be what I will be. I don't know, it's too close to the cartoons of Popeye. I am what I am, for me to use that expression. For years, I didn't know how we should translate it. It defied my ability to translate until several years ago. I saw an interpretation by Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg. He was known as the Ketav Kabbalah. He wrote a sefer called Ketav Kabbalah. Here's what he wrote. In Yiddish, he wrote it in Hebrew, but he thought he was correctly said to himself, not everybody's going to understand me how I interpret this in Hebrew. So he wrote Ehyeh asher ehyeh, and then he wrote in parentheses, Ich ken sein, was ich will sein. I can be what I wish to. Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in all of the universe that he created, only he is the only being that can truthfully make that statement. Ich ken sein, was ich will sein. I can be what I will. We do it, all of us as human beings, sometimes. A person wants to be a doctor and he goes to medical school. She goes to medical school. Sure, they could be. But that same person may not always be on time, maybe, right? Or doesn't mean they got 100 on all their tests. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe Rabbeinu, if you want to know the password, if you want to know to give people faith in the idea that a power well beyond them and well beyond Paro and well beyond all of Mitzrayim, he is the only being that can say, what I wish to be, I will be. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu, by the way, now I want to just talk about one other facet of his being there. There are three views about how he was there. One is he was chasing the sheep, Aaron's sheep. Second view is that he took the sheep, all of them, beyond the desert, so that they wouldn't encroach upon other people's property. Rashi mentions that, of course, and it's to protect other people's property. Another view is took them beyond the desert where there were other people at that time grazing to protect his own sheep. But then the Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Netziv, says he went the hit boded. Moshe Rabbeinu went in the desert to contemplate, to think. Just because he didn't yet have his full identity and his own self-identity doesn't mean he wasn't a contemplative person. He was the contemplative person. And he went there, and interesting, the Hebrew word lehit boded is made up of two parts, perfectly describing. Boded means to be alone. Lehit boded is to make oneself alone. He went and only in the desert could he think. You know, it's interesting. I once took a trip, anybody who's been in the desert, and whether it's in Eretz Yisrael or other places, I once went on a tour to on the desert in the Negev. Okay. And we were met by a person. They had actually, it was with a group, and he comes out and he says, let's walk. Doesn't describe a thing, not a thing. I was quite disappointed. But I wanted to know what this plant is, and I wanted to. That's me. So I wanted to. Didn't talk about it. Just says let's walk for a while, and then we are at a part of the desert which I really don't know at all. Can't recognize it. He says, now I'd like the 15 of you to line up, and he said, here's what line up one after the other, and I'm going to give you a signal. The first person, when I give you a signal, I want you to go and find the place, any place you want to go in the desert. Within 2 or 3 minutes of here, you'll walk. Second person, third. Okay. So I walked out, and I began to see that there was a method. His, I guess you'd call it madness. He considered telling me all about the flora and fauna of the desert is a disruption in the experience. Because he, as a man of the desert, he was a Jew. He wasn't a Bedouin or anything, he was a Jew. He saw the desert as the place, the hitboded, to concentrate on oneself and within oneself. So sure enough, I walked. And I had to say, I had a lot on my mind when I went, and I'm walking, and there I see there's a cliff that I came to with this deep gorge right under me. I said, oh, this is the place. I sat down, and I was zocha. I literally was able to look inside myself and to think out certain problems. If you've ever been there, it's absolutely silent in the desert. Absolutely silent. And there I thought, and I realized at one point, because this happens to all of us at one point or another, I realized what I had to ask myself, who am I and what am I? There's no better place than to ask that in the desert with no auditory interruptions, visual a bit because of its beauty, but and I came to a conclusion. Everybody is defining me, but I have to define myself. At that stage in my life, I had decisions that had to be made. This one defined me, that one defined me. And so finally I sat down and I realized I had to define myself. This was the experience that Moshe Rabbeinu had. By the way, they're the analogy. They're the comparison ends between me and Moshe Rabbeinu. But Moshe Rabbeinu, at that point, was undefined. He knew who he wasn't. He knew he wasn't an Egyptian anymore. This is decades later. He didn't know what he was. So the Torah begins by telling us, Moshe haya roeh. It's not what he did that the Torah is telling us. It was his being. His being was to be a leader. His being was to take care of those beings that were defenseless, and to take care of them, and to bring them from any difficulty that they may encounter, and to help them overcome the difficulty. Now, I would like to add one other thing too. You know, this ties itself. I've seen more than once that we have laws of physics, Newton's laws of physics. We won't go into all of them, but Newton, Newton had one law that one of his laws, which we're not going to talk about here, was that, an object in motion continues in motion unless it acted upon by another force. Okay. But there's another one of Newton's laws, and that law is that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The law in physics, just like the first law that he had, this law is also true when it comes to the spirit. The more one focuses inwardly, not selfishly, but inwardly, contemplation, lehit boded, the more intense that hitbodedut, that contemplation is, that's how spiritually, in a desert which has no borders, that's how spiritually that contemplation expands out. That's what it was. That was his experience. And of course, in my own little way, that was my experience. There are no borders in the desert. There are no elements which prevent us from being able to expand our thinking and expand our contemplation of what we can be. The concept of ich kann sein, was ich will sein. I can't do it everything, I'm a human being. In the end, I am. That's all I am. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu made us in his image. Therefore, there is a relationship between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and us. And so therefore, every person, in some sort, needs to be able to say, maybe I can be in this area of my life what I want to be. I want to be a tzaddik. I want to be I want to be a better father. I want to be a better husband. I want to be a better wife. I want whatever it is that I want to be, a better student, right? This, to that degree, it can sein, was it will sein. But I've got to work at it. And that's what we have to do. So this is the story of Moshe Rabbeinu and the beginning of his life in the desert. And it starts in the desert. That's where he develops his identity. That's where he realizes the second part of his identity. Not only what he wasn't, but what he was. He was a Jew whose future was tied inextricably to the future and the destiny of the Jewish people. And now he is now ready to fulfill the first part of his mission. Okay, I want to wish everybody a good Shabbos. Thank you for coming, and have a very meaningful Shabbos and meaningful coming days. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Shabbos.
much.
Thank you. Have a good Shabbos.
Thank you. Thank you. Good Shabbos.
Thank you.
Welcome, everyone.